I'm a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh in the School of Informatics, and it's my pleasure to run this seminar today, to chair the seminar, with the title of PeaceTech and Data4Peace, What Are We Learning? It's a fantastic, again, to join this seminar with the Peace Settlement, Political Settlement Research Program, which is run by Professor Christine Bell at the School of Law in the University of Edinburgh. And today in this talk, in the seminar, we want to look into the work that has been done by this group in inclusive peace since 2015. And in the last years, we have come to collaborate a bit more, Christine Bell and her group from the School of Law, and myself and other colleagues in the School of Informatics and Design Informatics on peace tech. So combining technology, data analysis techniques, and inclusive peace building. And today in the seminar, we have four panelists, four speakers who will line out a little bit or sketch out the space in which this research is happening. I'm going to introduce them in a second. I want to briefly show you, go a little bit through the organization of this seminar today. So the session will be recorded. Oops, sorry for that. The seminar will be recorded. The Q&A will not be recorded, so you're happy to just raise your voice and talk. The recordings will be available afterwards. We use also a live note, live captioning that should show up. We had some issues this morning, whether it's really working. Use the chat to post any messages. So you can just put your questions in the chat. We're going to take them after the panelists have been talking. I say a word about the organization in a second. And I hope that everyone is muted. So please mute yourself if you have not. We have also the superpower to mute everyone if there's a bit of noise, background noise. And then for the Q&A, we're going to, everyone can unmute and we can engage in a discussion. But more that at a later point. Okay, without further ado, I want to introduce the panelists briefly. We have Fiona Knäussel, who is going to talk about Introduction to Peace Tech, giving a bit of an overview of the current work by these groups. Then we have Sanja Badanjak, who's talking about data collection methods, about analyses and connectivity in this context. We have then a talk by Devanjan, who's from the tech side talking about map interfaces, APIs, which means something like points to get data from in this case. So where can we get data from? How can we combine these data using technology? And then we have a sort of a summary from Christine Bell herself on design processes and interfaces we did, some examples and kind of lessons learned in this field between inclusive peace and technology. And after that, we hope by 1:30, we can then engage in an open discussion, 20 to 30 minutes. Again, post your questions in the chat as they come. And then once we're in the discussion, we can go through them and ask them to the panelists. Okay, any further questions from the audience at this point? Anything that is not clear? Just put everything in the chat. And we want to move on to our first speaker, Fiona Knäussel, who is a graduate fellow with the Political Settlements Research Program, primarily focusing on peace tech and women's participation in peace processes. Her research interests also include the development of international legal frameworks for cyber warfare and artificial intelligence. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see Fiona large, and over to Fiona at this point.
Thank you, Ben, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to our Peace Tech webinar. I'll be talking about peace tech as a concept in general and give you a quick introduction to that. Also, as a quick note, the research that I'm presenting has informed our upcoming Peace Tech report series, so please keep an eye out for when that's coming out. And for many of you, I think at this point, the most obvious question is, what is peace tech? And maybe also, what isn't peace tech? As the name already suggests, and as Ben has mentioned before, peace tech is about the technologies to support peace building. And that can be either software or hardware, from the use of a smartphone to something much more complex, like a machine learning tool that facilitates decision making. And we've looked at that from two broad approaches. One is to adapt existing technologies such as instant messaging and social media to peace building. And the other one is to design a whole new tool that's then specifically aimed at a peace building purpose. Having said that, upon talking to other people in the peace building world, we have come across a few misconceptions as to what peace tech means. And a very common one there is that it's about the tools to tackle cyber warfare. Now, obviously, this is a huge new threat to peace in the world. But if you talk to peace tech people in the field, they know that tackling cyber warfare is another very different area. In our view, technologies and data are unavoidable in our globalized world. And this also applies to peace building, which is why peace tech is not about the conversation of whether technology should be employed in the first place. And that does come up when the topic of tech is on the table very often, but rather about how peace tech can be developed and used in the most efficient, cost-efficient, and safe way. To understand why we develop peace tech, it's also very important to look at what aims it serves that will benefit the peace builders on the ground. And there are many different ways of looking at this, but here are some that most peace builders would think of. And first of all, there is a need for understanding conflict trends and dynamics. By accessing and interpreting big data, for example, that's possible. And it's possible to gain new information and make sense of that. That also feeds into the learning aspects, the knowledge exchange and skills building that peace builders are constantly engaged in. Of course, that's also enhanced by being able to turn to new communication tools, which then again serve the aims of better communicating with and mobilizing local populations and conflict parties. Overall, let's say there is a great potential for technologies to enable inclusion and participation in peace processes, which is a crucial element in building a sustainable peace. So what kinds of peace tech have we seen so far? I think when hearing about peace tech for the first time, what many people find most fascinating is the many ways in which it can be done, and of course, looking at examples in practice. We've tried to give a broad overview of these in our report, but for today's talk, I've picked a few examples that I think represent the variety that we found in peace tech so far. And first, there would be digital platforms that can be communication platforms to serve particular purposes, such as enabling participation or gathering inputs from the wider public. For example, in Libya in 2018, the National Conference website was designed as an online mechanism to inform the UN-sponsored National Conference and to enable Libyans for 4 months to contribute to the process online. It was designed to make the process more transparent, inclusive, and legitimate. There's also geographical information systems. So the use of maps and geolocations to track movements and conflicts. That we will come to later on when Devanjan will introduce you to the COVID-19 ceasefire tracker. I think a peace tech talk wouldn't be complete if I didn't at least once mention a typical tech buzzword such as machine learning. And that also has many different subcategories and fields of application. One is the classification of data points that have come in from different sources. UN Global Pulse, for example, has applied machine learning to predict refugee and IDP arrivals after humanitarian emergencies. And they did that by aggregating the relevant data, such as conflict events, climate-related anomalies, and historical displacement flows. Lastly, I want to look at the use of mobile apps. And that's because nowadays mobile phones are more widely used than computers. And this is especially true for conflict-affected countries. So it is worthwhile developing applications that can be useful in peace-building contexts. At the PSRP, we have been part of the development of such a peace app called PeaceFem. Its main goal is to inform peace builders and policymakers on gender provision in peace agreements and women's strategies during peace processes. And I think it's a great example of what an app used in conflict-affected countries should be able to provide: concise and focused information on an easy-to-use interface, and all available offline. You'll find the link to PeaceFem in the discussion box. So at the end, I'd say at the core of many of those technologies lies data, may that be collection, processing, or interpreting of that data. At the PSRP, we have concentrated on what we call data for peace. And therefore, a lot of our peace tech efforts link to our peace agreement data, which can then be connected with other forms of data to both visualize patterns differently, but also to move from the peace agreement to question of how it was implemented. And data in conflict and peace research is what Sanja will look at more closely now.
Thanks for this overview, Fiona. I want to introduce Sanja briefly. She's a Chancellor's Fellow in Global Challenges at the University of Edinburgh Law School and an affiliate of the Political Settlements Research Program. Thanks, Sanja, for joining, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Benjamin, and thank you, Fiona, for setting this up for me so very well. So as Fiona mentioned, our PeaceTech work does have data at its core. So for us, it's the PAC's peace agreements data, to which we add building a wider network of data resources concerning peace, conflict, and peace building. Now, what's new about this work and what has changed in the last 10 years in particular has to do with the scale and the type of data that can feasibly be collected, as well as our ability to organize, collate, analyze, present these data. So on the one hand, a key innovation comes from increased ability to connect data resources related to peace and conflict. And this partly stems from advances in social sciences' reliance on such data and the drive in the social sciences to provide open source data. In the PAC's Peace Agreements database, our design concerns were focused on these issues. So for each agreement that we collect in PACs, and while each of them is very complex, we have tried to ascertain all the relevant metadata for each document that we hold. So primary countries, the agreement concerns, the conflict that it pertains to, conflict episode, and this allowed us to match the data and merge the data with other data resources. So something like the Uppsala conflict data program, databases on elections, data held by UN, World Bank, IMF, which are typically country-based statistics. So these data are sort of bread and butter and the core of what we do. And hopefully we can take this further by disaggregating these data to conflict actor level and placement of each agreement in a country level set of documents that sort of describe the form of the political sphere, such as constitutions, other elite pacts, referendums, and similar. Now, these are typically sort of very tidy data formats. They're dominant in research and for very good reason. They're your typical sort of two-dimensional spreadsheet, your Excel sheet, with features of units very neatly cataloged within. But there is so much data out there in other types of resources that are differently organized. So you can think of books, reports, witness testimonies, newspapers, social media posts, blogs. And one key innovation of the past 10 years has been this ability to extract data from unstructured texts and apply statistical methods to these corpora of texts. For the studies of conflict and peace, this has meant the opening up of so much new data from a variety of sources. So think ICTY archives, international organization reports, UN Security Council resolutions going back decades. Now, all of these have been available before, but have required a lot of time and work to deal with. So imagine reading through thousands of pages of non-searchable text to find instances of, for example, gender or let's say refugees or something like that. Now, most data portals and archives do now offer search capabilities, which is great, but the ability to access the raw data of these texts and organize them into a data set that can offer full insights into this entire repository of data with no limit as to the research question is an innovation brought by these text as data methodologies. This means that the entire text is transformed into a data source. Algorithms and statistical methods can then be applied to such a resource. And this has the potential to reveal nuances in things like the manner in which peace agreements talk about particular groups. Again, let's say women or refugees. We can discern whether the language used in one context gets reused and recycled to be used somewhere else. We can also show how issues and topics co-occur in documents or in peace processes, which is sort of what we're looking at the PSRP. It's also possible to link text to other features, like agreements to countries or third parties that are part of the negotiation. And we can tell whether topical content of documents correlates significantly with particular features of this context. So the possibilities are endless. You can think about comparing topics in agreements to topics in matching newspaper coverage or UN reports. In PSRP, we're running several such projects. So on the one hand, there's the PAC's corpus of peace agreement texts. So these are all peace agreement texts since 1990. And there we look at co-occurrence of topics and testing, for example, whether some third parties' presence matters for the topical content of agreements. Christina and I have also started working on historical cases of peace treaties and ceasefires from the Times Historical Archive, which goes back more than 200 years. And there we use these texts of newspaper articles to identify historical peace agreements, but also to see how a key newspaper, such as the Times, talked about peace and negotiations over a very long period of time. Now, these new sources of data are immensely useful and interesting, but they also create new problems in terms of scale and computational ability. So a lot of this you can do on your PC, but a lot of it you can't. So for example, our Times Historical Archive data contain 5 gigabytes of plain text, so just plain text. Your Microsoft Word can open a document that has a maximum of 32 megabytes of plain text. So there's this tension between bigger data, more data, and the available computing power and sort of abilities of non-institutional research. And this is a sort of dampener on what PeaceTech may be able to do. Now, in our case, we're able to rely on University of Edinburgh resources, so large-scale servers that store the data, multiple core computers and supercomputers that sort of crunch the data for us. But it is a concern, and it is one of the issues in data collection and analysis that we've come across. And it sort of joins the other problems of data curation, stewardship, and accessibility. So really, this is all just a sort of intro into these issues that have to do with the use of data in studies of peace and conflict and peace building. I would argue that when it comes to data, we need a more intentional, planned approach. And the issues that are of particular concern are things like ethically sourcing and combining and merging data. Then having a solid understanding of data structure, data provenance, content, and limitations. So in a sense, knowing what you can sensibly do with the data. On top of that, there's also data reliability and veracity. Where's the data coming from? Who's producing it? And with what aim? And finally, there's this issue of returning the results to those that produce the data resources in the first place, other researchers, policymakers, practitioners, citizens, and doing this in a sort of accessible and responsible manner. So these issues of data sort of abilities, computing power, methodology, they sort of are inevitably and necessarily linked to these concerns of validity, reliability, ethics, and of returning data to where they've come from. There's a lot that can be done with the data, and I'm going to leave it to Devanjan to talk a bit more about specific projects that pull data together and sort of bring it back into the world for everyone to see and check out. But thank you so much. Benjamin and Devanjan, back to you.
Thanks, Sanja. This is a really nice summary, this kind of challenge between power and ability, right, that I'm hearing here. So we move on to Devanjan, who is a postdoctoral fellow with the PSRP at this moment. And he has a background in geospatial visualizations, geospatial technology, artificial intelligence, NLP, natural language processing. So technology is related to what Sanja was basically just saying to get a grips with these data. Thanks, Devanjan, for joining, and over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Hello, everybody. So again, it's really nice that Sanja and Fiona has laid the groundwork so well, so that I can just walk everybody through the technologies that enable us to actually look into the data. We are talking about data for peace. We are talking about peace technologies. So how does the data actually affect and impact our work, the output that we generate for people to use, for other agencies to use? So we know that over the last 1 year, everybody has been pretty much hooked on to different kinds of dashboards, different kinds of data visualizations like maps and other kind of graphical visualizations to understand has been related to the ongoing pandemic. Everybody around the world, at least in each country, people have looked at their own national dashboards to know that how the pandemic is panning out and how our lives are getting affected. So related to that, we know that when the data comes in, we need to have background processing available. So that is what we call as interfaces, and that is what I'm going to talk about, how the data comes through the interfaces for us to utilize it. Our domain, of course, being PeaceTech, so we utilize it for peace, but data can be utilized for a number of other activities as well. So I'm just going to introduce those interfaces, what kind of mapping has been done for PeaceTech, so that we get a very meaningful and impactful visualization for people to understand about the peace activities going on, the ceasefire declarations or the conflicts globally that have been affected by COVID infection rates. So as I said, in recent times, we have looked at so much of visualizations online as well as on television around us, in other media as well. So I would just like to bring to our notice how these interfaces actually work. So we all have seen the Johns Hopkins University's COVID-19 maps, but we must also know that there is a huge amount of data that goes into those maps and are also available through their own interfaces. So these interfaces are popularly called as APIs, application programming interfaces. They allow for the computer systems to understand and download the data and directly use in different kinds of programming activities. So this is not just limited to maps. It is the same with many other resources on the web, like Google Map, Twitter interfaces, and we have data downloading capacities from Facebook and other social media. So they all have their own APIs to access their data. And we use same kind of technology for the PeaceTech domain. We have so many data sources, like our own proprietary in-house data source that Sanja and Fiona mentioned, the PAX database, which are rich data sources and available to anybody through APIs. So at the back end, the interfaces that are provided for our own activities as well as the dashboards that we create are available through APIs. So one such dashboard is the COVID-19 ceasefires dashboard that PSRP has developed, that next Christine is going to demonstrate as well. So I would just like to talk about how the different sections of that dashboard, the COVID-19 ceasefires dashboard maintained by PSRP works. So we developed it in an interactive map-enabled dashboard fashion, so that visualization for peace building efforts as well as for conflict situations on overlaying data about COVID-19 infections globally according to the country and regional COVID infection rates, so that people can understand really how COVID has affected peace processes or ceasefire declarations. So that was the main intention behind the COVID-19 ceasefire dashboard that we put up. So the link is there in our chat links. So there are basically 3 broad categories in that dashboard. As you enter the portal, you would see at first the timeline, which shows the occurrence of all the ceasefire declarations one after the other in time, beginning with March 2020, when the first ceasefire call came out from United Nations. This is the first part of the dashboard. Other than that, the dashboard also has a search and filtering mechanism. The filtering mechanism allows one to look at the ceasefire declarations country-wise or region-wise and according to certain keywords, filtered keywords. So you can pull down data related to many ceasefire activities globally with the filter mechanism. And then, of course, is the map dashboard. So in the map, it's the global map which has in the background the COVID infection rates and the ceasefire activity going on in that part of the world. So if there has been any ceasefire declared and if it has been affected by the COVID-19 infection rate going up or going down, so that information is captured very precisely in that map interface. So if you look at our link of the COVID-19 ceasefire dashboard, you would find that the three sections, interconnected sections, are very easily accessible, and you can just by typing your the keyword that you are looking for, you can get a lot of information downloaded and visualized on the map. So basically, the backend design that is maintained by PSRP allows for the data to be pulled from the Johns Hopkins University database COVID-19 infection rate, and on top of it, our own collected ceasefires data is overlaid to give us a very nice allusion to what is going on around the world related to the COVID-19 infection affecting the ways of a ceasefire declaration. So now it would be appropriate for you to visualize on screen how our dashboard actually functions, and you can visualize its working. So I hand it over to Professor Christine Bell to walk you through the visualization part.
So there's one question came in which somebody actually asked, how do you determine when a ceasefire declaration has been affected by COVID-19? I'm just going to answer that before I sort of move into my talk, because it actually can be used as an illustration of what I'm going to say. We really struggled with this. So the reason we collected ceasefire data was because the UN Secretary General made a global call that in the time of pandemics, it'd be a really good idea if people just dealt with the pandemic and ended all their conflicts. It may sound naive, but it was a powerful call that had a lot of resonance. And in fact, some groups began to respond. In some cases, the groups said they were responding to the call. In fact, sometimes they said they were responding to the call when they weren't, when they were probably going to go on ceasefire anyway. And other times they linked things. So in fact, we actually just call it a ceasefires in a time of COVID-19, because it was impossible to completely know whether the motivation was COVID-19 or not. And what we do is this in ways, it becomes important in the second interface. If I share my screen, can somebody nod to me that that's actually working? The screen share when I did it before, was the right thing being shared? Okay, amazing. It's showing up for some reason in a very strange way on my computer. So if you look at the search mechanism, we give information where we explain what we think the connection to it was. In some senses, we don't make a strong call for what that causality was. But we felt that whatever the ceasefires being called at this point, particularly ones that were reflecting back a response to the global call, we would include that. So just to pick up then on my talk, my sort of short presentation to pull this together. So Fiona talked about PeaceTech and I suppose the place of data in it, which has been the space that we've been working in. And Sanja talked about the potential of connecting data and new data and big data, particularly illustrating with, again, the type of work we've been doing around peace processes and how they're structured. And Devanjan talked about some of the technical capacities that are needed to put data together. So I just wanted to talk about then the processes that are needed. So it's clear even from our talk that we've come from quite different disciplinary backgrounds and projects. But for the ceasefire data, if I give a quick illustration of why we produce this and how, I think it begins to show what types of capacities and conversations are needed to engage in this type of work. So first of all, a group of practitioner researchers came together, hosted by US Institute of Peace, after the UN Secretary General's call, and including the mediation unit of the UN, to basically say, right, this call has been made. How do we track if anything's happening in response to it? What's happening in response to it? How can it be supported? How should we be telling countries and other actors to support it? And it became clear that when we all swapped data from what we knew was going in the field, because we had people from probably about 12 countries in those meetings, updating us on what's happening in Colombia, what's happening in South Sudan, we brought that, we realized there was a need to do more systematic data collection. And also that opened up questions like the ones I've just answered of, are these related to COVID-19 or not? Does that affect how we support it? Does it affect the expectations we have? So different researchers had research projects on ceasefires collecting, including us and, for example, HZ Zurich and Norwegian Peace Institute. And we started to collate that data. And then we undertook at PSRP to think about how to visualize that and create a collaborative mechanism for collecting it. So we designed here, and really through that interactive process and keeping going back to the end user group that wanted to use the data and saying, does this look useful to you? Do you know, can you work out how to use this? For example, we'd initially planned just to do this, to do a basic database like this, but somebody said, well, really what's useful is to see a timeline of how things are unfolding. And so we produced this type of interface. And then actually when we took it back again, they said, we're getting a lot of questions about how the ceasefires relate to what COVID-19 might be doing. So we began to explore how could we bring together data about ceasefires together with data COVID-19. And of course, if we were doing that manually, it would be really hard because the ceasefires data doesn't change really frequently, but the COVID-19 data changes every day. And this was why we had to look like solutions such as Devan's talking about, of how we would pull from a reliable source in an automated way, involving things like APIs. So on this map interface, the COVID data is updated any time that John Hopkins updates it, because it all happens in an automated way, whereas we add the ceasefires manually. And what that really illustrates, I suppose, is the type of collaboration that I think is at the heart of all this work, which is understanding. It's very seductive to just collect data and say, let's see what we can see from it. But often really what works better is to decide what it is you need to know, and then what data is out there that might help you to know it, and how might you bring that data into articulation in some way. You need to, I think, be looking at the problems you're trying to solve and be actively talking to the people that are engaging with those problems. You secondly do need to have a very interdisciplinary conversation that connects with what I would call this praxis conversation. And you need to bring the right capacities to the table. And our experience is there's huge difficulties in actually even having the same language in which to have that conversation. And you have to view it as iterative and developmental, and always having feedback loops to the problems you're trying to solve, and then using those feedback loops to try to solve the problems and develop the interface and the data to make it more useful, but also to the people that you're trying to support in using it. And I think those type of ingredients and that type of circular research process is really quite intrinsic to most cases. It'll often involve bringing people from different disciplines, but also different working backgrounds, NGOs, international organizations, researchers, technicians, even private sector providers of things like visualizations. So just stop there. We have a number of PeaceTech examples. We've only just touched on really one or two today. All of it's available through the Peace Agreement's website, and we'll be unfolding this series of seminars to focus down on different things we've done, such as the PeaceFem app in the forthcoming months. Thanks.
Thanks, Christine.